Good evening.
You're listening to Chasing Prophecy Radio, where we discuss anything and everything beyond the scope of normal. On UPRN Talk Radio FM 107.7 in New Orleans and FM 105.3 in Mississippi.
If it's unexplainable, we're talking about it.
Whether you're a believer or a skeptic, we cover everything where the unknown becomes the known.
And now, here's your host, Jenny Nicasio.
Hello, everyone, New Orleans and beyond. This is Jenny on FM 107.7 and 105.3 in Henderson Park, New Orleans, and streaming everywhere around the world. I'm Jenny Nicasio, streaming on the United Public Radio. I hope you all can hear me. Sometimes this thing doesn't really work. Sometimes it does, and hopefully it does tonight. So I just want to let everyone know that you can comment in the chat if you have any questions for me or our guest tonight. But first, I want to talk about some of today's hot news in and around the world and in the paranormal realm. Ron DeSantis withdrew his candidacy for the presidency. So that's good. That's good news for all the conservatives out there. It's a hot topic all over the news tonight. So if you want to chime in anytime, you can chime in. But we're going to look at some news headlines today. And around, well, just not today, the last couple days. So the UFO and extraterrestrial realm. Recent headlines discuss the legislators and the classified briefing of the jellyfish. UPA. I think I said that wrong again. But there's a lot of talk about that. Jeremy. I can't remember his last name, but anyways, I think you guys know who he is, who has the documentary UFO Revolution out there. I don't know if you had a chance to see it, but it looks like the Pentagon did what they said was they didn't deny it or they didn't confirm that it was true. It was authentic. So that leads me to believe that it's probably for real. I don't know if you had a chance to see the documentary, but I watched season 1, 2, and season 1, episodes 1, 2, and 3. And it looks, at first when I saw it, I thought it was a smudge on the lens, or even some people thought it was snot. But the more you look at it and how it changes, it makes you really believe that it could be something. So that's good news. But the Pentagon said that they're not denying it, but they're not confirming that it is authentic. So I think it's the only thing I don't understand about all these hearings that they plan to have and had in the past. Their transparency is not like, I thought they were going to let us know what it is. A lot of people claim that they don't think we can handle the truth. I don't understand why they think we're like little kids sitting at the little kids table at Thanksgiving. I don't get it. We're adults. We can handle it no matter what it is. But that's one of the things. There's also unexplained astronomical events out there, astronomy events that's happening. Astronomers have reported and discovered a cosmic object that defies current scientific explanation out there. They're not telling exactly what it is, but they're saying it's unusual. But that's something to keep your eyes towards the news to see what they come up. What is this? Is this another black hole? Could it be some kind of portal out there? Is it a new comet that's going to hit us? That's something to think about. I'm not really sure I like the idea of a comet coming at us at, from billions light years away. So that sounds like it could be good. But there's a new documentary out there, and I'm trying to get the author on. I've emailed him a couple times. It's a new docuseries it's called God versus UFOs. Now, this is making waves all over the internet and TikTok, and it might be interesting to explore because there's themes and claims made in this documentary that's going to make us really think about our belief system and what we believe to be like the beginning of Christianity, Jesus Christ, everything from the Big Bang into supernatural things that are occurring. That this is a really good documentary, and you could probably get the book too on Amazon. It's called God versus UFOs. Some other news in the paranormal field: supernatural healing and nature. So a lot of people, now I've claimed this before, and I do believe that you can heal your body through trees. Now, I know a lot of people think I'm nuts. Those are the same people like myself who believe in earthing. So that's a new thing that there's been a lot of scientific research saying that you can be healed through the trees by touching them. And if you go out there, even in the wintertime, there's some kind of energy that's coming from the trees' roots that actually heal, which is so cool. And I totally, hi Mark, hi Cindy. I totally believe that this is a phenomena that is legit. I mean, I've talked about this a number of times in the past on the show, how I believe that my tree outside healed my legs. At one point, I could not stand without falling over because my legs would go numb. So there's a lot of new research on that. And then another headline: Pope Francis, he did a presentation on hell, which could lead to a discussion on a whole new topic. So we're gonna delve into that in future shows, and how he believes hell is, something really legit. But I heard a lot of stuff in Catholic religion that they talk about hell and they deliver us from evil, but no one really actually has a open discussion about it. So this is something to look at. Some other news: a woman believes she contracted cancer due to the curse of Pompeii. So I don't know if you know the whole story about Pompeii, but that's something you never know. There's a lot of discussion on that in the paranormal field about that too, about how she was cursed and now she has cancer. I think that curses are legit. I do believe they've been cursing people forever. Even talks about curses in the Bible, so that could be something to talk about in the future. More news: alien observations and ancient civilization. There's a theory suggesting that aliens could be observing ancient civilizations on Earth. Now, we know this through all the caves. If you go back in history, there's caves that actually show figures going even into the pyramids, in those caves where they have all the mummies, that there are pictures of human beings with helmets on. So they could be ancient aliens. So that's good that they're talking about that now. And they've always been talking about that. And another news: in Uganda, an African magician reportedly used bees to handcuff a thief. This could open a discussion. Could you imagine being handcuffed with bees? Oh my God. And he uses magic and supernatural methods to actually capture this thief. That's really weird. And then we also have Suzanne Summers passing. Her husband has now had some experiences that he truly believes now that there is life after death, and we don't have to talk about that. We all know that. And so that's another one. And there's been I have this one that, let me see if I can pull this up. Let me see if I can find it. There's an airline that actually was in the news stating that they admitted to using chemtrails with chemicals, spraying them on us So that's exciting. I know. I mean, they've been doing chemtrails for every. Oh my God. Have you ever gone outside and see the chemtrails? You know they're poisoning us. I don't know why they can get away with that. How they're trying to kill us with all these chemtrails. In other news, the NATO tells us to prepare for war. How exciting is that? I don't understand how this could be happening, and there's a lot of crazy stuff. It kind of makes me upset about it that you know we're dealing with this kind of stuff nowadays. There's just so much stuff going on, and then also going back to the Miami incident with the creatures, the 9-foot creatures. They're saying that the news is blowing it off, but it's all over there and it still keeps going on and on. So it kind of makes me wonder how many more other events are going to happen before they actually tell we are being invaded. I mean, they're all over. We were getting more and more reports about these incidents where creatures are being seen in people's backyards. So how long is this going to go on? It's kind of crazy if you ask me that it keeps going on and on and on. It doesn't seem real that we live in a day and age where they're saying they want to be transparent about this stuff, but we can't handle it. We're too much about we're like little kids and we can't handle what's going to happen. But it seems like the more we get to the election, the more you're going to hear more stuff like this happening. So I don't know what you guys think about that. But there was one other thing I wanted to talk to you. Oh, a woman sues California because we're going to play this at the end of the show. I think a woman sues California because she believes she saw Bigfoot in Oregon. She said she has the pictures and she went to the ranger and they denied it. They said it wasn't Bigfoot. So, okay. But she was so terrified that she got so close to this thing and has videotape and they denied that was it. And she believes that she should be heard. So she's suing them. So that's pretty cool. But we're going to go ahead and I'm going to introduce our guest tonight. It's going to be a cool show, I believe. I think she's going to give us a little, let me get this up. I want to make sure I get the bio right. So I don't want to screw up her information, but where is she? What is it? I'm seeing it. Okay. Her name is Leanna. I hope I don't screw this. Renee Hieber. She can correct me when she comes on, but she's a best-selling, award-winning author, actress, playwright. She's a ghost tour guide. She's written, a series for Tor and Kensington Books, A Haunted History of Invisible Women. I'm not sure. We'll get into that. We'll see what that means. It seems, I guess, women who aren't not really invisible. So I think they're just not being seen. But maybe I'm wrong. True Stories of American Ghosts. Co-author this was Andrea Janes, was a Bram Stoker Award-nominated for the superior achievement in nonfiction. Her short fiction has appeared in numerous notable anthologies, and her books have been translated into many languages. Her nonfiction essay has appeared in Apex Magazine and Deadlands and A Feminine Macrame and more. Lena has been featured in film, television shows like Mysteries at the Museum and Beyond the Unknown, discussing Victorian spiritualism, and she's lectured around the country on themes of Gothic fiction. So without further ado, let me bring her in. Welcome to Chasing Prophecy, Lena. I hope I didn't screw up your name that bad.
Hi, I'm Leanna.
Oh, Leanne. Okay, I screwed that up. Okay.
Hi. I'm here to talk about A Haunted History of Invisible Women, True Stories of America's Ghosts, which is a book that Andrea and I wrote in fall of 2022 is when it came out, and we've been talking about it ever since. It's been a real, very popular book that has discussed how the intersection of women's history and the paranormal has a lot to say and a lot to tell us about how we view women alive and dead.
Okay, when you say invisible, do you mean like invisible, like that we don't see them because is that what you mean? Or do you actually mean
we mean it in the literary sense of sort of a double entendre. So
Okay.
we mean it that, like, yes, a lot of people don't see spirits. A lot of people, or if they do, they're sort of transparent. And we also a lot of times don't see women in history. We don't. There's
That's what
a
I was
great
gonna say.
deal of invisible labor that happens. Now, there is a book called Invisible Women that is directly about living women whose labor is not seen and not appreciated. So we want to make sure we differentiate. So this wonderful book called Invisible Women is about women's invisible labor. Our book, A Haunted History of Invisible Women, is about women's visibility through history and how that intersects with their ghost stories. Each woman that we talk about in this book is
Mhm.
a woman that has a ghost story attached to her. The veracity of this is sometimes, completely up in the air. In several cases, there have been complete fabrications of stories, but even where we note that there has been complete fabrication, the reasons why people have felt compelled to make something up, we still feel that that's important to discuss, because it's still storytelling. It becomes urban legend. And at a certain point, sometimes if you believe something enough, it starts to have its own truth. It starts to kind of become its own reality in its way. So we try to walk the line between truth and fiction as best we could, without being able to prove anything. Andrea and I are historians and tour guides. What we can verify is when a certain building in New York City was built and what the city
Yeah.
records have to say about it and who lived there. And then the paranormal stuff, we're not, frankly, personally invested in disproving or proving one way or another, because it's really about the story. And
Yeah.
then for paranormal investigators and for science to figure out at some point, because I personally believe that science and the paranormal are not antithetical. I think that the paranormal is probably just a science that hasn't been completely figured out in our current methods. So, we'll see on that count, but we still think the storytelling is important.
Of course, it's experience. Have you ever had any personal encounters with the paranormal?
I
And if you
am
could
I
share it.
Yeah, yeah. So if as co-authors, Andrea and I are both kind of we're sort of in the X-Files dynamic of the Mulder and
Oh,
Scully.
yes.
Of that, she's more the Scully, the completely analytical, a little bit more of a skeptic. I'm the one that's really more the believer, and I've had more personal experiences. Now, she's had some uncanny things that she'll be the first one to say that they've been these things she can't quite parse, but I've been having them more consistently in my life since I was a child.
Can
Um,
share a couple.
yeah, so I ever since I was young, I just there were certain things that I would tap into that I couldn't know how I knew something. Things that I've sort of attributed to past life knowledge, things about the past that I knew that I hadn't necessarily been taught, yet I knew the answers to some of those things. When I first traveled to London when I was in college, I knew my way around, even though I'd never been there. And sure, I'd done some studying and things like that, but there was just that innate sense of being somewhere before, even though you have not been corporeally there, some kind of connection, things like that. When I was researching things, I've been a writer for as long as I can remember. When I'd be researching things, because I was always interested in historical accounts, I would sometimes be tapping into things before I even read what the truth of that was. So having worked in many different haunted places, I also had many different encounters and moments in different haunted spaces. So before I moved to New York City in 2005, I was living in Minneapolis, the Twin Cities. And I was living primarily in St. Paul during my run in the Twin Cities, and I worked for a haunted cave,
Oh, that's
the
interesting.
Wabasha Street Caves. It was really cool. It was a speakeasy in the 1920s and 1930s during Prohibition, and things would go on there that we would sort of attribute to the boys, because there were bullet
Mhm.
holes in the fireplace there,
Oh,
and
wow.
there was evidence of violence. And so it was thought that during those mafia years, when the speakeasy was a part of it was a location on the bootlegging run of illegal liquor coming down from Canada and over across to Chicago, with St. Paul being the hub, because the mayor was really in bed with the mob at that point, and like pretty much let it be a free for all. And so the cave where I worked had a history, and
Mhm.
we thought it was not possible to really prove this, because they didn't exhume the back caves, but it's thought that those who died, and the evidence of the bullet holes were probably buried in the back caves to dispose of the bodies easily. Those caves had been mushroom farming caves in the 19th century. So they had their own long-standing history before it became this nightclub. So with all of that being said, the boys would move things. They would turn on lights when we'd turn everything off. When I was leading tours through there, I would be the only staff person there. It would be a nightclub and an event venue in the evenings. And then during the days, we would take groups through. So it was just one staff person there. It was just me. But the old historic photographs that I would set up, they'd almost always be upside down by the time I got back to them. I'd set them up on the easels right side up. And then probably the most notable thing, the thing that kind of makes me chuckle to this day, and the thing that is the most direct evidence for me of something otherworldly, is I was tipped by a corporate group I'd led through, and they tipped me a $50 bill. And I was there as an actor. I was a starving artist, and that $50 bill was going to be groceries for 2 weeks. And so I tucked this $50 bill in my back pocket of my work outfit, and I buttoned the back pocket, and then I went to close everything up. And when I went to the door to put that $50 bill in my wallet, that $50 bill was not there in my pocket that I had buttoned, and I'd taken specific care. Like I'd folded it, I tucked it in, I made one doesn't just be casual about a large bill. So I retraced all my steps frantically. Everywhere I'd been, in the back cave, in the ballroom area, in the dining room area. There was only a few places that we actually would take people through, only the finished parts of this. And so nothing was there. And I did this several times. And finally, I just said to the room, which is sometimes how we would have to resolve things. I just said to this open ballroom area, boys, I know that you all dealt in money, but I am corporeal. And I understand that money is what you know. It is what I know too. This corporeal body needs that $50 bill. With all due respect, right? So I didn't know what else to do. And in my experiences, sometimes when you're in a place where something odd might be happening, actually kind of confronting it, actually not in an aggressive way. I don't like going into a space and like being aggressive towards spirits or anything, but basically just sort of drawing the line is sometimes helpful. So when I went my rounds again, there was my $50 bill laying crisp, laid out flat right below the bullet holes of the fireplace.
It was just laying there
like it had been specifically laid out. I had folded it like 4 times. It was laid out crisp right below. I hadn't even gone over there by the bullet holes. I hadn't even gone towards it. So I couldn't have dropped it over there because I hadn't gone close to it. I point it out. It's very obvious from across the dining room. All of the bullet holes and the grazing is very
definitely they were playing trick on you.
So I said, all right, well, boys, thanks for returning my money. That's very good of you, because otherwise we're going to continue to have words. So that's when people ask me, like, how do you deal with being in haunted spaces? And I'm like, well, if you don't like what's happening, then you do have to draw your own boundaries, and you do have to sort of establish the line between, what your corporeal world needs and what they're trying to get you to acknowledge. If we have time, I'll definitely. I have a couple of other stories about
go ahead.
Boundaries.
That's what we're. I'd love to hear ghost stories.
All right,
go for it.
Yeah, I was researching another book, and this didn't make it. Neither one of the reasons why I'm telling these particular stories too is that these stories didn't make it into A Haunted History of Invisible Women as a book, because these were stories that I couldn't verify the gender of the ghosts, and we were focusing just on women's stories. In the case of the bootlegging, the haunted speakeasy, it's pretty safe to say that the bullet holes and the deaths there were probably men. A lot of gang violence and mobster violence in that regard. So generally speaking, they didn't gun down ladies in nightclubs at that point. But in the case of another event in Salem, Massachusetts, notoriously haunted Salem, Massachusetts, as we know. Here was an interesting haunting that didn't have anything to do with the Salem witch trials, which we do write about in A Haunted History of Invisible Women because of the sort of psychic stain that violence has left on that small town, and how the town still grapples with that. So we do talk about that in the book, but in this case, this was completely separate. This was just the case of a haunted building, namely the Hawthorne Hotel. Now, this is notably a haunted hotel. They will be the first one to tell you that. In fact, they advertise their various hauntings on their blog. Haunted hotels, it's good for business. So I was on the 6th floor, and I was there researching something that wasn't about ghosts. I was there actually just researching part of the harbor. There's a little port and a little lighthouse, and there's an old historic ship, the Friendship, that sits in Salem. And I wanted to kind of set a piece that I was working on in that harbor area. And so I wanted to walk that long pier. I wanted to get a sense of the water there, just get a feel for the atmosphere, because as a fiction writer, atmosphere is everything. So I was there just for that. I wasn't there for any other particularly haunted aspect. But it was 3 a.m. Of course, it's 3 a.m, right?
Everything happens at 3 a.m,
It's the time. It's the time. So I'm a pretty light sleeper, but I was resting really peacefully. But I was awoken by a very strange sound at 3 a.m, and I listened to it for a little while. Now, I should say that just because I'm a believer, doesn't mean that I will go and believe that something that's happening is paranormal right away. I don't believe that right away, because I don't think that we should let our imaginations rule us, because we are powerful. Our minds are very powerful, and we can be inventing stuff all the time. And we can create a haunting just with our mind. And I've done that before. And so I don't want to lead with that. I want to lead analytically and say, okay, what am I actually hearing? What could be making that sound, and why and how? And it's this very distinct sound of jingling keys. We all know the sound of jingling keys. That's something that's very familiar to us. And it was going up and down the hall, back and forth. But then I started thinking about the other things that I was and wasn't hearing. The jingling sounded far away, like I was listening to it through glass. That was curious. And then I thought, why am I not hearing footsteps? I'm just hearing the keys. I'm not hearing any footsteps. It's an old hotel. It was built in the 1920s. So not as old as some of the foundations of Salem, but it's still been around at that point, almost a century. And old floors creak. You can hear footsteps, even though it was carpeted, so it would have been muffled footsteps, but you would still hear footsteps. And I heard no footsteps. And so as I'm considering this, the jingling is getting closer to my end of the hall. I'm the last room at the end of the hall in room 606. And this jingling is getting closer. And then I think to myself, why am I hearing keys at all? Because the Hawthorne Hotel right now it's a key card entry. So no one would actually have their keys out to get into their room. Okay, so these are two things that do not add up. And so I think, well, third time's the charm. It's gonna have to be the rounds of a groundskeeper, a maid, a service person who this was part of their rounds, checking in on the rooms, going back and forth, and checking in on things from a time long ago. I'm thinking this seems perfectly normal, this. And as I'm thinking this and putting it together, like, oh, I'm actually having a clairaudient haunting of a worker here. And then this jingling stops outside my room. And then the next thing I hear is another sound that we all know, the sound of a fingernail across wood, a scratch.
That's a nasty one.
A scratch on the headboard of my head, of the bed, the headboard just above. So it's this wooden headboard of this older, antique looking bed, and this fingernail scratch that sounded directly across it, 3 inches above my head. And I don't scare easily. I started working in historic spaces right out of college. I started working in doing productions involving supernatural things when I was working in theater. Almost everything I've done professionally has had some angle to history and or the paranormal. So not really easy to startle, but the fingernail scratch when I couldn't see anything, but just that very specific sound, that really got me. So I
because that's a real distinct sound.
It's so distinct, and it was so close, and that was the thing. That was so close. That's when we talk about the boundaries. Sometimes you do have to set boundaries of what you are and you aren't comfortable with. And so I realized I kind of took this moment of going into the zone of like, remember your training of working in paranormal spaces, the training being acknowledge the spirits. Half the time they just want to be acknowledged. Half the time they're like the boys in St. Paul in the caves.
Yeah.
They just wanted to prank me. In this case, this was, oh, someone's awake and they noticed me. Ghosts notice when they've been noticed. So this was a way of communication because I was hearing them, not seeing them. So they were giving me another audible cue. And so I thought, well, ghosts want to be acknowledged. This is a worker. They probably spent a lot of time here. They probably weren't thanked. I always like, I
Yeah.
always like to tip my servers. I always like to thank the workers. So I just said to the room, thank you for all of your wonderful work through the years. The room is very nice. You've done a great job. We appreciate you. And then
Anything?
my heart is in my throat. And then jingle, jingle, jingle down the hall. There
Oh,
with that was that. That it
they
was
left.
exactly what they wanted
They
to
just
hear.
wanted
Was
to
they
be acknowledged.
wanted to be acknowledged. And so that more often than not. So both of those things back to back for me within the span of just a few years really was an interesting sort of a lesson for me of I was given this uncanny experience. My prompt was to acknowledge and or to speak with whatever had been doing the thing, and then I got a result. I got my money back. The jingling down the hall stopped, and I was not disturbed again. And the next morning I went down to the front desk, and they were like, "How'd you do?" And I said, "Well, do you have any haunting stories about 606?" And they're like, "604, yeah, but no, 606, no. What happened?" So I told the story, and they're like, "Can we write about this on our blog?" I said, "Only if you let me write about it on my blog." So
Mhm.
all of us in the industry, we know that like we have to share these things because it is part of it's a part of the draw. And these historic hotels and the historic house museums that we talk about, Haunted History of Invisible Women, we talk about how difficult it is for these historic homes to keep their doors open because it's just so expensive to keep to maintain. So if you have a haunted story, you're going to tell it and run Halloween tours through
Yeah,
there.
you have
Or
the
in the
tours.
of the Winchester Mystery House that I do a whole chapter about, you're going to have a fine line between fact and fiction there because the story is what people bought into. It's why they got the ticket, even though a lot of that history was falsified. So I really understand and empathize the fine line that a lot of people are put into. So we do talk about the ways in which we think that that's been harmful in some cases, where it's adding sort of insult to injury onto his places of historic tragedies. Um, and also in some cases where it's completely taken a woman's reputation and made her into something she's not, like in the case of Sarah Winchester, who was made out to be crazy when she was anything but. So one of the things that's most important for me about talking about spirits is also about talking about the living and where are our boundaries and how are we talking about people alive and dead in the ways that we can engender a certain amount of respect and hopefully a better society. I mean, to be a little to be a little hopeful about it. That's what I'm trying. I really do feel like, spirits do want to be acknowledged. And I do feel like I work on behalf of the spirits in that regard, to really be uh, a part of their experience, and me filtering in through what I know in my limited knowledge of being alive in this time and space. I certainly am not going to presume to understand the great mysteries of the beyond. That's that's above my pay grade. So but in the meantime, I can try to make sense of where we are, and I think that ghost stories really help people process a lot of stuff. And I
Yeah.
think that's for me where the real importance of this is talking and having discussions with the living about the dead in a way that can help people process their grief, in a way that can help people tell their own stories. Every time I talk about these kinds of things, I have people that come and bring me their ghost stories, and they talk to me about things that happened to them, or they'll share with me about how our book helped reframe how they think about storytelling and the importance of it and how to do it respectfully, which I do think you have to do.
Yeah, it's a unique window into the past too, when you intertwine them, the history and the event
Yeah.
that leads up to the haunting. So
Right,
it's
right. And it makes these historic houses contemporary for you if you're having a haunted experience inside a historic home. It makes that past very present for you. And that's
Mhm.
actually really exciting. And that's how you can get people interested in history that might not normally be interested in history. And that's another mission that, a sort of an extra benefit that ghost stories can offer.
Yeah. Like one of my favorite is the Winchester story. If for
Yeah.
somebody who doesn't know, can you give a little brief description of what that is?
Yeah, I'll talk about the Winchester House briefly. It is my longest chapter, so I will self-edit from going and waxing rhapsodic about Sarah Winchester. I think she's one of the most fascinating women in the world. Um, and and I think she's been done really wrong by history. Not because of anything she did wrong, but just because of the circumstances of
Mhm.
her being a little eccentric and building a very quirky house. So she became one of the wealthiest women in the world in the 1880s when she inherited all of this 50% of the holdings of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. So her husband, William Winchester, and her father-in-law, Oliver Winchester, they both died within relative quick succession of each other, already after Sarah Winchester and William had lost their baby daughter. The sequence of loss hit her really hard, and she was just devastated by all of these things. And then here she was after these deaths, one of the most wealthy women in the world. And so she
Mhm.
she was in Connecticut, um, and the Winchester Repeating Arms Company continued production in Connecticut. She moved out west to kind of get away from all the places and spaces that reminded her of William and her baby girl and her, all the stuff that was full of loss for her. And she was very shy. She's very introverted. She did not want to be a part of high society. And as a wealthy woman at that point, you were supposed to be a centerpiece of high society. She wanted nothing to do with that. She was really introverted. And so she kind of hid out in this 8-room farmhouse that quickly became, over the course of the next 15 years, a 160-room mansion that just kept going on and on and on and on. It's a house within a house. It's sort of a Russian nesting doll of a house. You
Yeah.
can still see the pieces of that original farmhouse. And the reason why it's so quirky and the reason why it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense is because Sarah designed it herself, and she had the money to implement workers building it for her. She was fascinated by architecture. It was one of the things that her and William loved, was talking about construction. They had helped manage the building of Oliver Winchester, of his new home, and that was some of the happiest memories that she had with William, was of managing this property and seeing a new house come to fruition. And something about that really captured her. And so she subscribed to every single architectural journal that existed at the time. And then she would just sketch out her designs and then pay workers twice the going rate of anybody that was paying for any labor in California. She paid
Yeah.
twice that. And she engendered this loving group of people. She would give her workers houses on her 160 acre. So it was both 160 acres and a 160 room mansion. It was this huge sprawl. And it was all farmland. It was orchards, and that paid for the house itself. It was a huge operation, but the orchards were profitable, and she was getting money from the Repeating Arms Company. But there was a lot of people that had a lot to say about her, and they didn't have access to her. So rumors spread really quickly about why was she doing what she was doing. Was she Very quickly during her lifetime, the rumor spread that she was a spiritualist who had been told by a psychic to go west because you are being pursued by the ghosts of those killed by the Winchester rifle. Sarah never said one way or another how she felt about the guns. It was
Mhm.
one of those. Oliver Winchester had created the company, had bought the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. He bought it to try to get contracts for the Union soldiers. He wanted to actually for the Winchester Repeating Arms Company to be the company of the Union Army. That contract didn't happen, but westward expansion did. And it was a gun used by lots of folks. Native American tribes used the Winchester rifle. They called it the spirit gun because it kept firing.
Mm.
And so, there was lots of anxieties about gun violence that our country's not ever come to terms with, that were being kind of put on to this woman and her choices that people couldn't fathom. Why was she building this endless house? Well, frankly, it was like a dollhouse. She just had the money to make it real. And she just,
Yeah. She just
so
kept on.
so there's no verifiable name that tracks with any of the people who were advising and being spiritualists at the time. There's nothing that tracks it to a specific person, and the people closest to her, her niece and her workers, her secretaries, they said, no, she wasn't a spiritualist. She never held seances here. I don't know what you're talking about. But it was a convenient thing for people to say because it was this juicy rumor mill about the lady with all this money who doesn't let anybody in her house. She was cultivating sort of air of mystery, not because she wanted to, but just because everyone wanted access to this wealthy lady who was only ever seen in veils. She never stopped mourning William. She never remarried. That was another thing. Here's this wealthy lady. Women are supposed to get remarried, especially at that time in the
Yeah,
late
really.
19th 20th century. Here she was, the queen of her castle with no lord over the manor, as it were. And folks wanted in. They wanted access to big parties and things like that. She didn't let anybody in. She was only seen under a mourning veil. She had rheumatoid arthritis. It was starting to disfigure her. She was very self-conscious. But it made it much more of a story to be that she's this, crazy lady who's eccentrically building on her house to stave off the ghosts who want to get her. And that myth completely became codified when she died, and the house was not mentioned in her will. She didn't mention the house in her will to anybody.
So she built the extra rooms to ward off. She wanted to confuse the ghosts, or
no, that's all a story. I'm sorry to burst anybody's bubble, but that's all a made up story. She kept building because she enjoyed the process of architecture. I don't
So
think
she just did it because she enjoyed making a bigger home.
She enjoyed architecture. She loved employing people, and her father was a woodworker, and he built cabinets, and she loved woodworking, and she loved the craft of it. I think in her mind, now there is eccentricity here. Like, while she wasn't completely a madwoman and building feverishly to appease the ghosts, that was never something she said to anybody. That was never something she wrote about. That was never something that any of her loved ones who were in the house, any of her staff, ever verified. They're like, that was a story to get people to buy tickets to that haunted house that opened after her death. But so the reality is that, yeah, it's a quirky choice. And so, yes, there's an eccentricity there. There was an obsession with building, but it wasn't necessarily tied to this madness of trying to escape ghosts. In this regard, it was just kind of her hobby. It was like a train layout for somebody who's a model train enthusiast. Now, is the place haunted? Sure, but it's haunted by people who lived there and loved her. She had a very close relationship with her staff. Some of the additions that don't make sense are because with her rheumatoid arthritis, there's only certain places she could get around in the house. So she made some adjustments to be able to actually get around the house. The switchback staircase that has these tiny little steps, it's not there to confound anybody. It's there because she could only lift her leg a little bit. And there's certain passages that were built because she had a wheelchair, and there was a little bit of she had an early electric elevator that would go into some parts of the house. There's other doors that go to nowhere, yes, because when the 1907 earthquake hit, half of the house fell down. It was 7 stories, and then it became 4 stories after the earthquake, and she didn't rebuild. And because she didn't rebuild, that really made a lot of Californians angry. They thought she was sort of, people wanted to rebuild. That was like an act of defiance. It was an act of like, we are stronger than nature. And that was a real thing. And so because she didn't rebuild any of those floors and then just let the door go to nowhere, people had a lot of opinions about that. And they wrote about them in the newspaper about how this crazy lady wouldn't rebuild. And all of these things just became this aggregate rumor mill that has a little bit more practicality than it does of any of the myths and legends, but the myths and legends had taken hold during her lifetime and were kind of impossible to put back in the box once those had gotten out. And the building opened a year after her death as the Winchester Mystery House because the guy who took it over was an amusement park operator. So he's like, okay, we're going to make this into a mystery house.
Yeah. Did he make up all the stories that went along with it? When you
the obsession with 13, she did have some of the staircases did have 13 steps. But the 13 seance hooks in the seance room, those were added. A staff person can tell you that that seance room was a gardener's bedroom. It was not a seance room.
Was there any stories that were like ghost stories that were true? Like, do you recall when you wrote the book?
There are. The house is haunted. There are the staff haunts the house.
So
And
it's
there
the
are
staff, not the people who were killed with the Winchester
none of
guns.
that tracks. None of the
That's
people
all
killed.
made up.
All of that was Hollywood. I mean,
Okay.
Helen Mirren did a beautiful job playing Sarah Winchester for that film. And the thing that she got right about Sarah Winchester is that she was smart, she was kind, she was generous. She gave millions of dollars in those days money, millions of dollars away to charity.
Wow.
And a lot of it anonymously. And she was very generous, but she very much did have her head on her shoulders. She just was quirky and liked building. I think in her original plan, she wanted to have the rest of her remaining family live out there with her. She had moved out there because a sister had moved out there, and the land reminded her of a place that her and William had been on their honeymoon, and there was a nostalgia there. But I think at a certain point, her own pain, she did live with relatives there, but I think she wanted the kind of idea of housing, being able to house everybody and reclaim a certain sense of family that she'd lost. There really was a grieving
Kinda
widow at the
sad.
heart of this, a grieving mother at the heart of this. And the
Mhm.
grief is there, and you can feel that. And the house still remembers, like, now this is me kind of putting this on the house a little bit, but when I went into the room where Sarah
So
passed, she did pass in
you've
the
been
house.
there?
Oh yeah. Oh, I was not about to write about this place without
How long
spending
did it
time there.
take for you to go through the whole house?
Hours, because I
Yeah.
I signed up for multiple tours, and then I also was gifted the generous time of the house historian who took me around.
Can you stay there, or do you have to get, like, a hotel?
You can't stay there. No,
You
you
can't
did
stay
that.
there.
You cannot stay there.
Okay.
Yeah. So it was I was at the nearby Days Inn, but but you cannot stay in the house. Um, it's open. They lead tours just about every day, but no one is allowed to stay there. Um,
When
but
you say she had I have rheumatoid arthritis, and my house is nothing. I mean, it's like 3,000 it's big, and I have a hard time going through it every day. I
yeah.
can't did she ever go through the whole house? I mean,
Not
or
no. Once the rheumatoid arthritis got really bad, most of the areas were not used and not functional, so that it the building was an obsession. So that was the building was a bit of a compulsion. And so that has its own kind of quirk and oddness to it for sure. I'm not saying she was not without her eccentricities. She certainly was. But the reasons for it were more just a fondness than it was being driven by a madness or being driven by this concept of appeasing the ghosts. That was a convenient narrative that the amusement park owners made, because that's the thing. The building was going to be torn down. It was a year after her death. She didn't name the house to anybody in her will. All the interior items were auctioned off by her niece. And they had a legal assessor take a look at it, and they deemed it of no value because they didn't know how to
mm,
use it, because so much of it was just a little nonsensical, and not all of it was fully finished. A lot of it was unfinished. And so they were going to tear it down. And then this amusement park gentleman, John Brown, was like, you know what? The mystery house over in my Niagara Falls amusement park has a lot of visitors. They love this mystery house with this narrative attached to going through this haunted house. And so he created a haunted house. And so much of what we have, and it went into books as just, this is fact, that he took over her house and he got to create the narrative, and he was doing it to as a financial enterprise. And you know what? I can't completely blame him, because if he hadn't have come in and done that, that house would have been torn down. We wouldn't have this story to tell. We wouldn't know anything about trying to separate the fact from the fiction about Sarah Winchester. So, it's one of those interesting things where sometimes, does the fictions created about somebody justify doing it?
yeah.
I don't know. See, that's, and I don't necessarily try to tell you what to think. What I do try to do is give you a sense of the generosity of Sarah Winchester, her love of her staff, the staff's love of her, and the fact that yes, it is haunted. Don't you worry. When you go to the Winchester house, you will hear stories of the hauntings. There are sounds. There are things that have people have been seen who are staff, who you can see in photos, are from the early 1900s, who are walking around the grounds. Clyde is the most famous one. He's in this boater hat, and it's very Clyde really loves the house, and people have seen him often. He's the most reported ghost there. He's in a very distinct hat, and people just think he's a part of the staff. That, because the staff do have a uniform, like for the women, they have a long skirt and like a striped blouse, and so everyone has a bit of a uniform, and it's a little bit of a period look. So people just think he's staff, and they're like, "Oh no, that's Clyde," and then they point to this, picture of the staff, and there he is.
Yeah.
So again, the place is haunted, but it's just not haunted in the way that people think. I think that people want to make hauntings out to be these big jump scare things. I don't think that's the case in the Winchester house. I will say that when I went into the room where she passed away, she did die in that house. When I went into that room, my heart actually had I had a palpitation,
Mm.
and time did that weird thing that it does sometimes when you're in a place where there's some kind of haunted resonance.
Like energy.
um yeah, you can feel the energy, and I I didn't know that was the room that Sarah passed away in. I just had this moment, I had this experience, I had this physical reaction, and then the tour guide told us that that was the room where she passed. And we had seen other bedrooms that had been recreated to look like what they would have likely looked like at that point, although there weren't many interior photographs ever taken of the Winchester mansion. So they were rebuilding a lot of it and replacing it with period appropriate furniture. Everything had been sold off after her death. So it was an approximation. So we'd been in other bedrooms, and I didn't know that this was the one that had been hers. And then that heart palpitation was a little bit telling, because then they said that she actually did die of a heart complication
Oh,
in that
wow.
room. And so something in me and something in my body kind of knew and felt that ahead of hearing that. So if you're open to things, you will experience something there. You'll feel it. And then when it's Halloween, they do a terrifying haunted house that they create, and they make jump scares for you, and then you can go and be absolutely terrified, because
That's
they
true.
do like Hollywood special effects, everything. It's incredible. It's a great setting for these things. And again, the house has to make money. The guy who runs it now and owns it now is used to work at Disney. So, everybody's got to figure out how to
It's a great
keep.
tour attraction.
Yep. So it's a tourist attraction, and that's the house historian is like, she said to me, she's like, I have to walk a very fine line, because I have respect for Sarah, and she could tell that I did too. So I encourage my guides to say, here's the myths that were told. Here's the truth of it. Here's this strange house. It is weird. It's confounding. You get completely confused. I got so lost. Tour guides who work there still get lost. So it is confounding. So there's absolutely reasons why in a lot of these cases where there's stuff there that's weird and unusual, and it draws us in. I just prefer when people know the fact versus fiction is all.
That's good that I like how you do that. Victorian spiritualism plays a significant role in your work. Okay, what aspects of the period fascination with the afterlife do you find most compelling?
The whole realm of Victorian spiritualism is, to me, it's so fascinating, because there's two tracks to it. There's the people who are legitimately trying to help, and sort of serve as the role of modern grief counselors. And there were many people who were absolutely legit as actual psychic mediums, who were working probably very quietly, people whose names were never on theatrical marquees, people who were not out for their ego, people who were just doing it almost like an itinerant preacher, or a traveling doctor, going from kind of house to house, and then just asking for enough money to get to the next place, and just living very simply and looking at it as a calling in that regard. Those are the type of spiritualists that didn't get famous. The
Mm.
ones that did were the ones that put on elaborate shows and liked to fool people. So there were plenty of folks who got into spiritualism because it was popular, because they enjoyed a parlor seance full of tricks. A lot of them were very good magicians. And so most of the really famous cases that we know, a lot of which were debunked, were about the spiritualists who were trying to pull the wool over eyes. And also, I think there is room for a sort of a third class of people who are probably psychically gifted, and who I believe did have some talents, but because audiences expected something night after night, And I know from my own personal experiences, ghosts are kind of like cats. They don't always come when they're called. So sometimes you have to resort to tricks because everyone was a paying customer at a certain point, and you had to deliver on something. And ghosts are unpredictable, and so they're not reliable. So a lot of times there would be maybe a legitimate sensitive who did have to rely on, if they weren't able to make a connection, they're going to have to rely on a magic trick to give the audience what they wanted. And some people, even after folks were debunked, they would still go back. They would still pay to go again because they enjoyed the show of it. So it was this fascinating mix of yearning to connect at a time when, in the 19th century, even though technology was rampantly making new, interesting technologies for us, the Victorian era saw the birth of telecommunication, wireless transmissions. We have telegraphs to telephones to electricity, mass migration from rural areas to city areas. You have all of this change, and people were like, what about our spirit? And people were still dying of lots of outbreaks of cholera, yellow fever, red fever, tuberculosis, all kinds of mass death. Women dying in childbirth was a really high number. Infants, 1 out of every 5 infants didn't make it past their 5th birthday. It was a real time when people were struggling to hold on to faith, because faith was also splintering into all kinds of different factions. And you have the birth of all kinds of new offshoot religions. You have interest in the occult. You have interest in all of these different things that is across all the Abrahamic faiths. They're creating new different schools of thought. And so this was a real huge time of not only technological innovation, but of like spiritual and philosophical innovation and questioning. And the thing that I find most interesting is that this was an area where women were at the core of the spiritualist movement. Women were at the core of it. The Fox sisters were the inventors, basically, quote unquote, of spiritualism. But they were tapping into what was already in place between the Shakers and the Quakers, who were Society of Friends. The Quaker movement was very interested in communing with the Holy Spirit, but a lot of the language of the spiritualist movement adopted a lot of Quaker and the later Shaker terms of thought. And the Shakers were founded by a woman, Mother Ann Lee, who was interested in women being a core part of spirituality. And so that movement, even though it kind of petered out, there are still some practicing Shakers, and the reason why they get that name, both Shakers and Quakers, are because of the trembling with the power of the Holy Spirit and the connection with the spirit world, being a physical manifestation there. It was originally used very pejoratively towards them, but then they had sort of adopted it. But the Society of Friends is the actual name for Quaker school.
Well, so, it's such a captivating topic. Where can people find your work?
So, A Haunted History of Invisible Women, True Stories of America's Ghosts, can be found wherever books are sold. So it is published with Kensington Books. And so if it's not on your local Barnes & Noble shelf, you can order it in. Barnes & Noble's been pretty good about making sure it's always on their shelves. We thank them for that. Independent bookstores are great. If you have a local small bookshop you want to support, we would love if you would grab a copy there. So I'm at leannarenehieber.com. So if you just put my name into the search bar, you'll come up with my website. There's retailer links there. I'm on all the social medias. How often I check them is questionable, but I'm around.
Is that do you have any? Is that a fiction book that you wrote to a series?
So I have 16 fiction books out. So yes, I have tons of fiction books. So if you want my fiction, you can look me up and you can find me again wherever books are sold. The book that we've been talking about, that you'll see a whole chapter on Sarah Winchester, a whole discussion of Victorian spiritualism and women's involvement in Victorian spiritualism, which is really what I'm most interested in is the women's angle of the spiritualist movement.
And it's mostly historical, nonfiction, fiction.
This is my only nonfiction so far. All the rest of my books are fiction, and they all involve ghosts. So, so this is nonfiction, but my fiction is all also ghostly. So ghosts are the core of everything that I do, whether it's fiction or not.
You have a fascination with ghosts.
Ever since I was a kid, it just was one of the first books I remember reading was a chapter book about ghosts.
Well,
So
that's awesome. We'll have to have you back on and talk about more about your ghost stories because they love
absolutely.
hearing about ghost stories. But unfortunately, we're running out of time, and
I appreciate you for thank you for your
I
time.
found it so interesting, especially Winchester. I love that story.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for letting me wax rhapsodic about
Yes,
it.
I do love that story. So it was so wonderful having you on the show. We'll have to bring you back.
Thank you so
So
much.
good to see you. Everybody, thank you for joining us tonight on FM 107.7 in New Orleans and 105.3 in Henderson Park, Mississippi. I keep saying park, it's point. And this was sponsored by the United Public Radio. You have a great night,
Thanks.
everyone. Thanks again for joining us on Chasing Prophecy.